What does true inclusion look like in a small suburban church? Here I explore how St. Luke's Anglican Church welcomes and supports its diverse local community. Their work reflects core Christian values of welcome, dignity, and compassion, and ensures everyone can fully participate in the life of the church. Through the inclusion audit I conducted, I identified existing strengths and key opportunities for deeper connection, accessibility, and community participation. This audit reflects the social model of disability, which understands disability not as an individual's impairment, but rather a result of physical, social, and attitudinal barriers that society creates and must remove to enable full participation. Faith-based spaces like St. Luke's have a powerful role to play in building inclusion, when both physical and social access is addressed together. Today I'll be sharing findings from an inclusion audit I conducted at St. Luke's Anglican Church in Brownsville. This is a mainstream faith-based community organisation with a strong local presence. The aim was to investigate how inclusive the church is for people with a disability, not only physically, but also in participation, representation, and relational inclusion. I've used Miller and Kelly's framework of the 5 attributes of place to critically assess both barriers and enablers. My findings are based on informal community consultation, observation of the space, and analysis of the church's public-facing materials. The audit concludes with several practical recommendations that are grounded in both lived experience and relevant inclusion theory. In this presentation, I'll be sharing findings from the inclusion audit I conducted. The aim of the audit was to investigate how inclusive a local church is for people with a disability, not just physically, but also participation, representation, and relational inclusion. I've used Milner and Kelly's framework of the 5 attributes of place to critically assess both barriers and enablers. My findings are based on informal community consultation, observation of the space, and analysis of the church's public-facing materials. The audit finally concludes with several practical recommendations that are grounded in both lived experience and relevant inclusion theory. St. Luke's is a small, community-focused church in Brownsville, part of Wollongong on Dharawal land, and part of the Dapto Anglican Church network. It follows the Church of England tradition with weekly Holy Communion and services from the Book of Common Prayer. Built in 1882 on land donated by George Brown, the church is a heritage-listed building designed by John Horbury Hunt. The church offers prayer groups, morning teas, and food outreach. Volunteers, which are predominantly older long-term members, play a central role, and while inclusion is valued, there's no formal disability policy, and accessibility is largely informal. This audit draws on a small number of interviews and brief observations, so some perspectives may be missing. To assess the inclusion at St. Luke's, I've used the framework developed by Miller and Kelly in 2009, which outlines 5 essential attributes of place that promote full inclusion for people with disability. These attitudes include self-determination, which is the ability to make one's own choices and define one's own participation. Participation, which relates to meaningful involvement in community life. And social identity, or being recognised and valued for one's own contributions rather than being seen through the lens of disability. This framework also highlights relationships, which are the supportive and reciprocal connections that enable belonging and place, which recognises that inclusion is not just about access to physical buildings, but also about feeling welcomed, safe, and valued in those spaces. These 5 attributes will guide my analysis of the church environment and how it enables or restricts people with disability from participating equally in spiritual and community life. The first barrier I observed relates to physical access. St. Luke's has no wheelchair ramp or automatic gates or doors. The main entry requires navigating uneven ground and steps, and even the door itself is heavy and must be opened manually. This means individuals using wheelchairs, mobility scooters or walkers, or those with fatigue or chronic pain cannot independently enter the space. According to Milner and Kelly, the concept of self-determination is central to inclusion, as it means people with disabilities should be able to write their own script and choose when, how, and where they participate. In this context, the inability to enter the place of worship without assistance fundamentally undermines one's autonomy. It shifts participation from a personal choice to a dependent act and can discourage attendance altogether. Research supports this, showing that when access is conditional on help, people also often feel like second-class citizens, tolerated but not genuinely included. While physical access may be a barrier, St. Luke's demonstrates an important enabler through social identity. Many people with a disability take on visible roles within the church community, such as welcoming newcomers, serving morning tea, or participating in prayer teams. This visibility means they're known for their contributions and relationships, not just as someone with a disability. Milner and Kelly highlight social identity as a crucial element of place, emphasizing that being recognized for who you are promotes dignity and belonging. When individuals have defined roles and responsibility, it builds social capital and affirms their personhood. This active inclusion contrasts with being seen only through a disability lens and helps strengthen connections across the community. In this way, social identity supports meaningful participation and inclusion even when physical or policy barriers remain. Despite the strengths in social identity, participation at St. Luke's faces challenges. The church currently offers limited inclusive formats during worship services. For example, there are no quiet or sensory-friendly options, which can be essential for people with sensory processing differences or autism. Visual aids and captioning are also minimal or absent, which restricts meaningful engagement for people with hearing loss or cognitive disabilities. Milner and Kelly emphasize that participation depends not on willingness but on accessible environments that accommodate diverse needs. When services just don't consider these hidden disabilities, many individuals feel excluded or overwhelmed. This barrier highlights the need for more inclusive and flexible worship formats that support all community members to participate fully. Another key enabler observed at St. Luke's is the quality of relationships within the community. Many people with a disability benefit from informal, supportive friendships and connections with other church members. These relationships go beyond formal roles and services to provide emotional safety, encouragement, and a genuine sense of belonging. Milner and Kelly identify relationships as foundational to creative, inclusive spaces. It is through caring social ties that individuals feel truly included and supported to participate fully. Interviewees and long-term attendees consistently report feeling known and loved within this community, showing how social bonds help sustain engagement and resilience. These relationships also help bridge gaps where formal accessibility or policy may fall short, demonstrating the power of human connection in fostering inclusion. While relationships and social identity provide important inclusion enablers, the physical place itself can pose significant barriers. At St. Luke's, the building's layout includes stairs, narrow doorways and aisles, uneven flooring, and areas with poor lighting. Milner and Kelly argue that place is not just a physical setting, but also a symbolic one. True inclusion requires that spaces are both physically accessible and emotionally well-being. One church member shared a powerful statement: "If I can't enter or sit where others sit, I'm just not included." This reflects how inaccessible design can affect belonging and participation on a deep emotional level. Conversely, another attendee expressed, "I don't just come here, I belong here," highlighting how inclusion can also be powerfully reinforced through supportive, welcoming environments. This work aligns with Christian values of dignity, hospitality, and welcome. But to be sustainable, inclusion must be built into the physical environment, not just interpersonal goodwill. Addressing physical barriers is essential to making the place genuinely inclusive for all. Despite some physical participation barriers, St. Luke's provides important opportunities for people with a disability to engage meaningfully. When reasonable adjustments and flexibility are offered, such as modified volunteering duties or leadership roles tailored to individual strengths, people can fully contribute to worship and community life. Milner and Kelly describe opportunity as the availability of real, meaningful chances to participate and shape the environment. Without such chances, inclusion remains superficial. At St. Luke's, while formal policies may be limited, Informal arrangements often provide this flexibility, enabling sustained involvement, personal growth, and empowerment. These opportunities foster a deeper sense of belonging and confirm the community's commitment to inclusion. This audit of St. Luke's reveals a complex mix of barriers and enablers. Physical accessibility is a significant barrier, and many of these issues are compounded by the church's heritage-listed status, which restricts structural changes and requires sensitive, creative solutions to balance preservation with accessibility. This means that some traditional upgrades may be difficult to implement without input or alternative approaches from experts. Participation is further constrained by the lack of inclusive service formats. But during the COVID pandemic, the services were adapted by offering online attendance options, which were really beneficial to a lot of the congregation. Such flexible arrangements highlight the potential of technology to enhance inclusion and broaden opportunities for meaningful engagement beyond physical attendance. The church also demonstrates strength in social identity, where people have meaningful roles, and in the quality of relationships, which foster belonging and emotional support. Opportunities for engagement, while informally arranged, offer pathways for contribution and empowerment. We can see a pattern that emerges where informal support networks and personal relationships compensate for systemic gaps. Research supports this, emphasizing that inclusive faith communities need to balance physical, social, and policy dimensions to be genuinely welcoming. To move forward, St. Luke's should develop and embed clear inclusion policies that promote physical, social, and cultural accessibility. This makes inclusion sustainable and less dependent on individual relationships and informal efforts. To support more inclusive practices, I recommend a multifaceted approach grounded in best practice principles. So first, conducting a comprehensive accessibility audit and collaborating with heritage architects to identify adaptations that respect the church's heritage while improving physical access. This should be guided by universal design principles such as ramps, handrails, and automatic gates or doors to create environments suitable and usable by all, regardless of their ability. Secondly, I would suggest regular evidence-based disability awareness and inclusion training be offered to all staff, volunteers, and leadership. Training should focus on practical strategies for inclusive communication, recognizing hidden disabilities, and implying reasonable adjustments in community settings. Next, I would develop inclusive worship formats that accommodate diverse sensory and participation needs, including sensory-friendly services and live caption streaming. While also we can include and embed formal inclusion policies that reflect these principles and reduce reliance on informal practices. This fosters sustained cultural change. And finally, we could actively co-design all inclusion initiatives with people with a disability to ensure responsiveness, avoid tokenism, and empower lived experience as a foundation of authentic inclusion. Reflecting on this audit, what stood out to you most? Perhaps the gap between informal inclusion and formal accessibility, or the resilience of community members in creating welcoming spaces despite barriers. This process highlights that inclusion is multifaceted, requiring attention to physical, social, and cultural factors. Faith communities have unique opportunities to foster belonging, but must actively address these hidden barriers. It's important to acknowledge some limitations of this audit, however, including a small consultation sample and constraints on site access due to timing and other factors. These may affect the comprehensiveness of the findings, but the insights gathered will still provide a valuable starting point for ongoing reflection and action. Consider how this audit can be the catalyst of change, sparking conversations, policy development, and tangible actions within the church. Finally, it could empower people with disability to lead and co-design inclusion efforts, crucial to ensure initiatives are relevant and effective. What role might you or others play in this ongoing journey towards a more inclusive faith community?